All right, first up, UFC 210. Let's talk about the co-main event first. It was a big middleweight fight between Gegard Mousasi and Chris Weidman. I am assuming anyone listening to this podcast is probably aware of the circumstances that happened in that fight. Let's sum it up very briefly. We're in the second round. It's a big momentum swing. Gegard Mousasi seems like he's got Chris Weidman where he wants him, hits him with a knee. Referee Dan Murgliata stops the fight, says it was a legal knee. Gives Chris Weidman some time to recover, leaves the cage area a little bit. Murgliata comes back in, says, you know what, it's a legal knee. Well, now we got a problem on our hands. And after a little bit of back and forth, the commission comes in. It's a mess. No one in the arena has any idea what's going on. People on television had a better idea of what was happening than the people in the arena, because I know sitting there in Buffalo, we didn't know what was going to happen. I assumed the fight was going to restart at that time. And then they call it, and Mousasi's got to win. Luke, I know you've been talking about this on your platforms. You did an interview with referee Herb Dean. I'm just going to ask you generally, sort of, what are your thoughts on what transpired? Are you okay with? Is it just one of those wacky things that kind of happens in this sport, or is this completely avoidable?
Completely avoidable, no. And for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about this week, and I'm sure you have as well, which is that there are these non-uniform updates between, or I should say among states, that make for this kind of thing where they'll implement, for example, the new rules that were adopted and passed by the Association of Boxing Commissions over the summer, but they won't, for example, have an explicit carve-out feature for instant replay, but at the same time, they'll allow referees to talk to other referees who did see instant replay and then gather information from them. I mean, these are regulations that are this amalgam of all different kinds of variations of the unified rules with a regulatory process that is basically esoteric. Like, who knows this stuff? To me, there's two bigger problems here, other than the one I've already just mentioned. Number one is that the rule essentially is a really bad rule, right? The idea was if you had one hand down, you were gaming the system, and I think most people would agree with that. I did speak to Commissioner Larry Hazzard of New Jersey, and he seems to think it's a great rule, but be that as it may, they thought, well, if you had the two hands down, this would make it better, and it doesn't. It doesn't make it better at all. In fact, arguably it makes it worse. They have to have some kind of clarifying process here. And the other one is, and I really think this would have helped on the broadcast, who guides the viewer at home through what's happening? In this case, it was John Anik, Joe Rogan, and Dominic Cruz. Well, as smart as they are and as capable as they are, no one knows the rules except guys like Herb Dean. And I've said this all week. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the career of Mark Ratner. He is essential to the UFC's growth and its ability to get sanctioned throughout this country and, frankly, the world. He is a hugely important figure. But I don't know that he is best situated in that role to help us. I wonder, had Herb Dean been on that broadcast as an emissary from the commission or whatever the case and talked us through what was happening, I wonder if there would be nearly as much outcry after the fact.
Yeah, the problem that I have with this, and I can relate it to, sometimes you see this in a fight where a referee will see something that he feels, you can sense it, you can see it in his eyes, that he thinks it's an illegal knee, or he thinks it's an eye poke, or he thinks it's whatever the case is, and yet he doesn't commit to it. He doesn't make a decision. You have to be the ruler of your octagon when you're the referee, just as you have to be the ruler of an event if you are a regulatory body like a commission. And I think that hopefully this changes over time as New York gets more confident and gets more competent in regulating mixed martial arts. But I just feel like when I'm in New York and I've been around these situations that, yes, they know that they have the authority, but they're also sort of kind of looking around. I just get the feeling that they're like, we're new to this, and they have to realize that they're the boss. You know, when something like this happens, they have to know, all right, do we use replay? Do we not use replay? This is where we're heading with this, and they have to do it with confidence. It just seems like the worst thing to me when you're in the public and you're watching something, and we've seen this in Nevada for a long time, is to feel like these guys just have no idea what they're doing. And I think that that's probably a little too harsh when you're describing New York right now, but I think there's an element of that. And these guys, you're getting big fights. The UFC is not bringing small fights to New York. They've been waiting a long time to get in there. Next time they go to Madison Square Garden, they're going to blow it out again. Bellator is going there this summer with their top dogs. They have to get it together before this summer. They have to start acting proactively and looking at some of these issues before they occur.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And speaking to Larry Hazzard, I remember when they were setting up the MMA side of the Athletic Commission in New York, I remember I had seen headlines that New Jersey was trying to give them some kind of advisory help. And I asked Larry Hazzard about this. Larry Hazzard, by the way, for folks who may not realize, this was the guy who was the commissioner in New Jersey for the very first ever pro MMA show in 2001 when they first used the unified rules. That's the guy. And I said, didn't you guys provide some kind of advisory help with New York when they were setting this up? And he said, yes, they did. And those things were going smoothly, and those were productive talks, and even more than that, meetings and the like. But I guess there's been a personnel change over there, and he didn't know half the figures who were running the show. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all terrible, but that does mean that there's a question to be asked about what kind of core competencies the new folks have. You know, the woman that Big Dan Murgliata spoke to, who was on the sort of the octagon apron before he finally waved it off, is a woman by the name of Kim Sumbler. She is the MMA project coordinator in New York. I looked up her background. Almost all of her background since 2008 involves regulation on Native American territory. Now, that's actually an important job that in no way am I saying that is immediately disqualifying.
Yeah.
But, boy, you want to talk about a big jump from Native American reservations to, in fact, all the way up to, UFC title fight. That is a major, major leap, and I think some of that inexperience is bleeding through.
Yeah, I think so as well. And hopefully, like I said, I know that these – and a misconception, I think, sometimes is that people think that these guys enjoy being the butt of the joke and they don't mind. They do mind, and there's a lot of media attention on it, and I think that they realize that in this one in particular as well. Tony Giordani, walking out and talking to the media, he was blindsided by that. And I think that when you have those types of experiences, you're the executive director of a New York Athletic Commission going out and facing the media after what happened at the weigh-in and realizing that I am very incapable of handling this situation. I can't field these questions that are coming at me. Hopefully that sparks some change. Let's go back to the fight itself. Dana White came out and said it looked like Weidman was essentially on the ropes. I don't want to see a rematch. I hate the way that the fight ended, but it was headed in that direction very quickly. I would not disagree. I guess my question to you is that even if you agree with Dana White's statements that, yes, the fight was Weidman was on the ropes, he was on his way out, does that still mean that we don't do a rematch? Because technically you never know, right? I mean, you can feel like it. You can really think that Weidman was close to being out of there, but you never know. So does that demand a rematch in your eyes? Man,
that fight is just a mess, isn't it? I didn't like that fight to begin with. I mean, what I mean by that is, if you ask me, hey, are you interested in seeing Chris Weidman fight Gegard Mousasi? I mean, the answer, of course, is yes. Any fan that has half a brain would say as much. But one of the things that really kind of concerned me was, this is two fights in a row where Weidman had lost, and not just lost, but had I would argue, a late stoppage in the Luke Rockhold fight, and then a brutal, vicious KO against Yoel Romero, and then you want to fight Gegard Mousasi when he's on a hot streak? I don't understand that one at all. That seemed to be totally ill-advised. And then they had this fight that was reasonably competitive, where Weidman won the first, I think, by most observers, and it looked like Mousasi was on his way to winning the second, maybe even closing the show, although I don't think it got quite that far. And then this whole regulatory mess went down. The question you have to ask yourself is, how much of an appetite is there for a second one? I think there's some because they feel like that this was not the optimal way it should have ended. Whether one guy wins or loses is not necessarily the most relevant factor, but that it ended in a way that fights commonly end without commission interference, which is what I think they see. But now that, over time, more evidence is coming out where if you listen to the corner audio and even the microphone on Big Dan, you can hear that Chris Weidman is unable to answer basic questions about his whereabouts and the time. And I think as more of that comes out, and guys like Herb Dean being like, I don't know. The only real criticism he had was Big Dan's positioning, not so much anything else that happened after the fact. There's less of a view that this didn't go right. I mean, I want to be clear. There's still a lot of that, but I don't think there's enough. It's not like, I mean, on a much lower level, when Tanya Evinger got screwed by Mike England in Invicta with that armbar against Yana Kunitskaya. I mean, this is hardly anyone knows about that. But at the same time, the case was so clear that the referee did not interpret the rules correctly at all. No wiggle room. And you know this as well as I do. Commissions, the way they set up their regulations, they don't set up a lot of avenues for fighters to challenge them on things. They have to be really egregious things.
Yeah.
And according to the way the regulations are written, the Kunitskaya armbar was pretty egregious. This one, it's not so egregious, which pains me to say, but I don't think they're going to do one. I would bet against it.
Yeah. I don't really want to see it. Not that I wouldn't have interest in seeing these two fight again. Like you mentioned, it was a very competitive fight, and I would be interested in seeing it finished out. However, it's not something that I think fans are clamoring for. There is controversy, but there's also not an outrage, I guess, over what happened, unless you're a really dedicated Chris Weidman fan. There's plenty of good fights at the top of the middleweight division, but that